Flights have resumed at Hong Kong airport after a night of violence between protesters and police. At one time, protesters turned on undercover police officers, accusing them of being spies for Beijing. China's Hong Kong Affairs Office today branded the violence at the international airport as being near terrorist acts. The airport has reopened for staff members and travellers with tickets only. Well, let's get the latest on this and join Rosie and her team who are standing by at the Cube.
Very different scenes in Hong Kong's airport this morning. Take a look at this. Far fewer protesters still there, still making their presence known, but none of the violence and the skirmishes that we saw yesterday. Galileo Cheng is a protester that we've been speaking to here on Euronews and in the Cube. A friend at the airport sent him this photograph this morning. And we can see actually a statement from the airport does show maybe an indication as to why we're seeing a kind of descaling of the action there. They've said here, Hong Kong has obtained an injunction to restrain persons from unlawfully or willfully obstructing or interfering with the proper use of the airport. So there we go. Any person could be restrained, they say, lawfully. And the difficulty is working out what might happen next. Well, our foreign correspondent, NBC News' foreign correspondent, Matt Bradley, was at the airport and he sent us this.
Appalling violence here in Hong Kong, but this time the action wasn't on the streets of the city. It was here in the international airport, one of the busiest airports in the world. And this time it wasn't the police who seemed to be using the most force. It was the youthful protesters who occupied and shut down this airport for 2 days, canceling hundreds of flights. Now they did it by using their bodies, putting it right here inside this departures concourse and taking luggage trolleys and arranging them so that people who were trying to check in for their flights couldn't even get to the gates. And, you know, they also managed to find 2 men. One of them, who they accused of being a spy working for Beijing, and the other was a journalist working for a pro-Beijing newspaper, and they beat them. And at least one of them they tied to a trolley and dragged them around the airport. And that incited the police to come in and try to rescue the men, and that led to some running battles between the protesters and the police. It was a dramatic scene, and one that really changed the tone of these protests, because so far, these protesters have insisted that they're the peaceful ones. And we talked to some of the protesters, and they told us that still the balance of force is on the side of the police, that they're the ones who are committing the crimes and the brutality. But those images that have come out tonight are exactly what Beijing has been accusing these protesters of being, which is thugs. Now, the protesters, again, they say that they're innocent, that they're just defending themselves and defending democracy. But it will be up to the people of Hong Kong, the people who aren't protesting, the ones who are doing business, to decide which side they're on now. Matt Bradley, NBC News for Euronews, Hong Kong International Airport.
And these images give you an indication of just how violent it did get at the airport here. We can see not only that from the police there as well, but also the protesters. At this point, they actually caught this journalist, and you can see tied him up and didn't let him go. And some people had to be evacuated for medical reasons. So there was violence on both sides. Was that Matt Bradley just said? They were describing some people, the protesters, as thugs. Well, we spoke to Joshua Wong. He's one of the people who's been spearheading these protests. He defended the actions of the protesters.
With riot police brutality and China's spy to join the protest, we strongly experienced the crackdown on human rights, especially when police hold the guns point towards people. The clash happened and just trigger anger of people. In fact, before riot police come to the airport, people just gather at Hong Kong airport to have the assembly peacefully without any clash.
So day 6 at the airport now, what are we likely to see? Well, I spoke to a protester this morning, Erica, and she shared with me this image. And she said she's going back to the airport today, but with a slightly different narrative. They want to say sorry to all the tourists coming through the airport for the inconvenience. They said, never is our goal to disturb your journey, but this may be our last chance to save our home. There will be a presence of protesters at the airport today, but probably not with the violent scenes that we saw yesterday. As that looks at what's happening in Hong Kong's airport, attention is being drawn to outside. What's happening on Hong Kong's borders? The US President Donald Trump tweeted this. He said, "Our intelligence has informed us that the Chinese government is moving troops to the border with Hong Kong." Well, that relates to images we're seeing and videos that we've seen being shared by Chinese state media. Global Times, for example, shared this video, several videos, a montage they have here of trucks moving in, clearly military vehicles. They say the People's Armed Police have been assembling in a city bordering Hong Kong in advance of an apparent large-scale exercise. They're concerned about this, but this is what Chinese state media want you to hear. So the question is, what happens next for the people of Hong Kong, and will those protests continue?